Ida's Encyclopedia of the Horsehead Desert by Léna Wills. Read by Shameless Audio's Jack Verhagen, Elizabeth Knutson, and Aralia Audios. At first glance, one might look at this planet and see only a vast empty expanse of nothing but cold sand and rocks scraping against a giant and beautiful nebula. And in many ways they'd be right. But this land is far from empty or uninteresting when examined closer. I'm not sure who you are, reader. You might have found a copy of this collecting dust in a library, or buried in an archaeological database. Or perhaps you've discovered my home and are reading this directly from where I'm recording it. My name is Ida, the beetle merchant, and it's my hope this encyclopedia helps the reader appreciate the beauty of this place. 1. The planet. This planet has many names, mostly because the people who live here can't agree on a name. Some call it Atri, or the Dead Sands, Sisyphus, HN397b, Great King's Land, or the Horsehead Desert. But most don't have much of a reason to call it anything but this place. Either because it just looks like a useless ball in space from the outside, or they're too busy trying to live on it. People do live here, despite the sheer hostility. Not a drop of naturally occurring water, temperatures rarely above zero. Nothing else living here save the beetles that survive on corpses. Truly a testament to the resilience of humanity. There is something in great abundance here, however, and that is scrap metal. Centuries ago, before even I or the original settlers arrived, some great and powerful groups of people decided to have a great battle. The biggest in history, apparently. Thousands of giant battleships were involved, and a dozen or so fell to this planet, along with hundreds of smaller military things. Shortly after that, the planet was used as a dumping ground for even more garbage, much of it military in nature. But by the time it was settled, and when I arrived, and still today as I write this, those great and powerful groups of people and their fancy politics are preventing each other from setting foot here, or the surrounding scrap fields in orbit. Off-worlders are, therefore, very rare, and often don't last long, unless they're the smugglers providing the residents with the supplies that offset the laws of thermodynamics. A reminder that we mathematically can't survive with only the nothing we have here. Most of the scrap being military in nature has certainly influenced our culture. Old war gun and vehicle parts can be rehashed into new functional guns and vehicles, or stovetops and houses. In fact, bullet casings, colloquially called shells, are a standard barter currency here. From the surface, this planet can be breathtakingly beautiful. The nebula sprawls across half the sky, its cycle determined by the rotation of the planet and its orbit around the small sun, known here simply as the shine. The purple splendor of the nebulous gases envelops the night sky entirely at midnight on the solstice of the time known as winter, and entirely backdrops the shine at noon on the solstice of the season simply not known as winter. The colors of sands found on the surface are more varied than you might think as well. Pink, salty sand covers one area around a crater. Another region is made of gravelly, black sand. Another of tiny, sharp blue rocks. Another of white sand that's almost as soft as a blanket. And many other smaller variations that most don't care to notice. The light of the shine plays off each in a different kind of beauty. My favorite scene possible to see here, by far, is the setting of the shine over the pink sand sometime near winter, when the nebula rises and paints the sand cool hues around the shine's sliver of warmth. Apart from the nebula, Another thing that twinkles in the sky are the scrap fields. This is where the rest of the fallen from the Great Battle float around, and where the first to call this place home originally settled, before descending down to the planet. Those people are possibly responsible for the satellites that give this place an atmosphere the humans can breathe, though it could have also been the people who did battle, or the people who dumped their garbage. Nobody is quite sure. In any case, a lot has happened since then, and the scrap fields have developed into a monarchy, while this planet remains unruled, despite the long line of Scrap Kings' best effort to claim it as a full kingdom. The monarchy maintains the atmospheric satellites because they partially survive on the people of the surface, who have kept their own kind of order, for the most part, particularly in the rise of a rebel group known as the Peacekeepers, in an effort to resist being carried off to the scrap fields as slaves. The scrap fields have much more of a history of their own, but now I will write of the communities that have developed here, making something out of nearly nothing. Sand in your teeth. Term used to refer to a person who's lived in the unforgiving areas of this planet for a respectable amount of time. You need some sand in your teeth is a way to tell someone, usually an off-worlder, that they aren't tough enough to survive. 2. The Storm Plateau. It may seem overly patriotic of me to write first of my own home, but it seems appropriate to touch first on the community I know the best. The Storm Plateau itself is a massive rock structure that rises above the surrounding fields of sharp rocks known as the rock forest. The rocks of the forest are large enough to dissipate the wind below, but above them it's always blowing, hence the plateau's name. The wind here is strong. It brings us sand and dust from kilometers away, and few who don't live with it know how to cross the plateau without being blown off the edge or suffocated. My people live with it, and we know it well. It brings power through our pinwheels and protects us from outsiders. In truth, the Storm Plateau isn't a mountain, technically, or at least it wasn't always. The sides are formed of the same kind of rock as the forest below, but inside the plateau is mostly compressed sand, brought by the winds over many, many years. The sand gets more and more compressed as you go down, until you hit ground on the bottom, what is assumed to be ground level. The compressed sand is easier to dig, as I observed the beetles here doing, though constructing stable tunnels gets harder the closer they are to the surface. This is how we live. No building or tent can stand on the top surface of the plateau due to the never-ending storm, so we live in what we call the storm tunnels, running deep through the sand. The entrances are hard for us to spot, impossible for outsiders, and they lead down, down, very far to the harder packed sand where we dig our homes. The air down here comes from storm wind blowing through tiny holes in the rockside, and the food is a bit more complicated. I require neither, but I am unique in that regard. The beetles I mentioned are the common kind found on this planet, and they thrive in these sands. Outside, they live on the corpses of dead survivors, but here they have an ample supply of sustenance. Truth be told, I'm not entirely sure what they're feeding on, but I'm told they taste quite different from the corpse beetles. We also cultivate some small plants with what water we can spare, all obtained from outside. It's hard to describe the tunnels themselves, except to say that they're very drafty, yet have a sort of profound coziness to them. A feeling some call shelter comfort. Many people have added and maintained structures to the tunnels over the years. All of them had different styles of construction, and all of them had access to wildly different materials. Every time I travel out to do trade, I return to find interesting new additions, older structures collapsed, and others entirely changed from maintenance. The oldest structure by far, though, still stands. Very long ago, before I lived here, I had a spaceship. State of the art in its time, though I imagine it's been far surpassed by now. I crashed it directly into this plateau, back when the settlers of this world were still tearing each other apart. And I'm not sure how I got buried. Maybe it was my angle and the slick shape of my ship, or the sand was looser back then. But the ship was beyond repair, and I came to terms with the fact I was stuck here. I watched how the beetles tunneled through the sand and mimicked their movements as best I could. And, using my crashed ship as a center, slowly began to build the beginning of the tunnels you see today. When, after years of studying my surroundings, I finally started to venture outside of my new home, I met people who saw my metal frame and complex mechanics as an invaluable salvage opportunity. A few demonstrations of my machine-quick self-defense measures was enough to secure a reputation of unsalvageable. Even with this reputation, however, I never sunk to the debauchery of human survivalistic robbery, and I was able to convince a number of like-minded people to come live in the safety of my naturally defended home. It was hard living for them, but we were safe from bandits, and we cultivated our way of life. We are, many of us, merchants by trade. We sell the rare things we cultivate or trade for, and with the benefit of my experience, we've made great profits. That's how we get our water and other necessities. Crossing the storm is very difficult, even for the well-trained, and there was a time when only I, with my strong and balanced chassis, was able to venture out to trade with the outsiders. That's when I was conferred the title of the Beetle Merchant by those I traded to. But as I grow in experience, my community grows too, and I've gotten good at teaching my people. We have many traveling merchants these days, who each brave the storm every few months with hefty loads, and most return months later with even heftier loads. It's endlessly beautiful to me to have seen this way of life develop over the centuries. Rotten dry. Insult used to describe someone with exceedingly poor character, implying that they're worth more as a nest for corpse beetles than they are alive. 3. The junkyard. At this point, you may be thinking this planet quite an inhospitable place, where only the strong and wise survive, with little time for enjoyable pursuits. That may be the life of many of us, but now we come to the junkyard, where things are different. Just south of the plateau, sheltered from the wind in the rock forest, and in the warmest latitude, albeit with temperatures still rarely rising above 5 degrees, it already seems the safest place in the world. But what truly makes it peaceful is the people who live there. The junkyard is well known as the haven for the weak, or the pacifists' playground, because the people there offer no violence to adversity, offering instead a song and a hot meal. This may seem impossible given the state of the rest of the planet, and indeed it is somewhat of a miracle. The junkyard has always been a pretty safe place even before people settled there, given the conditions mentioned before, but in recent years the place has become a warm and loving community, and this is mostly thanks to the current leader, a radical pacifist and talented singer named Penelope. The scrap found in the yard is mostly dumped there during the short era when the planet was used as a garbage repository, and all of the weaponizable junk has been stripped a long time ago, so all that was left there was hollow metal husks that made for great shelter. There were people living in the shelters before the place was civilized, but they mostly kept to themselves. And blood did sometimes soak the rough and rocky sand. Penelope was one of those settlers, very young when she hit there. She and I have traded regularly in the past, and recently I had the good fortune of an opportunity to ask if she could recount the story of how she founded the junkyard, and she graciously agreed. I recorded her story, and will replay it here. Well, you probably remember those times, 'cause you're about... how old again? Oh, never mind. I was a little girl back then when I came here, all scared and cold 'cause I just lost my parents. Happens a lot here, you know. Don't remember them much, but I've written a good amount of songs for them. May they rest in peace. Anyway, I was cold and hungry, and stumbling on the smattering of empty metal husks in the warmer part of the rock forest was a miracle, let me tell you. The people there were unfriendly, so I kept my distance, like I was always taught, but I was too young to cook beetles or anything, so I had to start talking to the locals or I would have starved. So I went around town asking for food. Got a lot of guns pointed at my face. Very scary and all that. Most folks on this planet are pretty cynical about each other, but you'd be surprisingly hard-pressed to find someone who'd shoot a little girl. Unless maybe they were on their last day of starvation, I guess. Well, anyway, I eventually came across a shockingly friendly woman named Calfee, who eventually became my adopted mother. Of course, at first I was afraid she was just being nice to get me inside to eat me, but I had no choice but to trust her. That was probably the most important moment of my life. And she was the most important person in my life, because it was then that I learned that some people could be trusted, and people on this planet are only violent because they're thirsty and hungry. I'll love her forever. Me and Calfee founded the junkyard with that principle in heart, and though it was my idea, I will always maintain that Calfee made it happen. It turned out she was a merchant from the plateau, and she told me the stories of how you, Ida, founded the tunnels, and it really inspired me. It took a hell of a lot of planning and work, but with her connections to the storm merchants and my enthusiasm, we started reaching out to the other survivors sheltering around us with an irresistible offer. Put down your guns and work with us, and we'll give you everything you need to live. Many couldn't resist, being just as hungry as I was when I found Calfee. And those who didn't, we simply left alone. Me and my community have kept this ideology strong, partly in honor of her. We may seem a very fragile and valuable target for bandits seeking food, but what do those on either end of a gun really want but to live comfortably? With nobody fighting each other off, we have room to cultivate food and make music and art. To all who would rob us, we simply say what me and my adopted mother said to the first desperate survivors when we reached out to them, or what she first said to me when I was desperate. Won't you come in for a meal and a drink? It still baffles many that defense by hospitality would actually work on a planet like this. But it has, for Penelope's entire life. The junkyard also has a bit of a reputation of being protected by the legendary storm merchants, which keeps away the larger raiding parties. But still, it is an extraordinary community. I quite like the musical instruments that have been invented here. They have performances almost every day. Music is a luxury usually reserved for the Scrap King's court, so it's an amazing thing to hear on the surface, coming from common folk. Lover's teeth. Colloquial name for the two top front teeth. This name originated from the funeral tradition of a loved one using every part of their dead associate's body to survive except the lover's teeth, which are kept as a memorial item, sometimes made into jewelry. 4. The engine. The engine, standing in the pale empty desert far east of the rock forest, is by far the largest free community on the planet, in terms of population, by virtue of most people's natural tendency to set up homes near other people. It was always the largest settlement, even when it was young, because it's made of the crash site of a gargantuan battleship from that great battle centuries ago, supposedly the largest to ever fall on the planet. It was so large, in fact, that its engine alone still stands as the center of town, higher than any surrounding dune. The engine itself is the only part of the battleship it came from to still look like it did when it crashed, hence the name of the town. The rest of the hull and rooms and supplies and everything that survived in any form have been reused to make houses, guns, beds, and anything else. The ship has been stripped and distributed so much over the centuries that you can find pieces of it in every corner of the planet. The main reason the ship's engine hasn't been stripped as well is that many people for generations have lived in relative safety within its labyrinthine tubes and inner workings. There's also a mysterious air about the thing. Some people are afraid it might explode if they try to take it apart, or that they'll be cursed, but they'll more likely be attacked by the people who live inside. There's a persistent rumor from inside that there's still a lot of pipes in there that have never been explored, and people still venture in to try and find some off-world relic to sell to the storm merchants or trade with the off-world smugglers. The engine, as in the entire town, the name can be confusing sometimes, is built mostly of the scrap from the battleship, fashioned into structures that could be considered actual buildings. A lot of them are simply built around rooms from the ship. The town stretches almost to the horizon from one end to another, though it's hard to tell with how jumbled and stacked up all the residents are. There are roads of sand between, with makeshift stairs and ladders, catwalks and railings, and similar such things around the stacked homes. This is all very impressive and beautiful in its own sprawling way, and it may seem like such a feat must be the product of strong leadership. However, the engine has never had a leader. Not any kind. Everyone who lives here does so out of mutual self-interest. In fact, many residents are quite afraid of each other. Conflict is very frequent, and almost everyone is armed. A subset of the rebel group known as the Peacekeepers attempt to, well, keep the peace. But as they have no formal leadership themselves, aside from a vague code of conduct, they often start as many fights as they stop. Though in the interest of fairness, I should specify that they, for the most part, don't start fights with people who are acting peaceful. That's not to say everyone in the engine is a stranger. Families and friends do flourish here, however reservedly and protectively, and it remains the trading hub of the planet, however armed and cautious. Many of the resources that come into the planet from off-world do so in the engine, particularly in a large business structure known as the repo, short for repository. It's built and guarded like a fortress, with all purchases made at gunpoint with exclusively shells. Stealing from it is out of the question, though many have tried and still do. And the prices are high, but it houses the largest selection of food and water on the planet. It's owned and operated by a select few local merchants, in collaboration with both off-world smugglers and the Scrap King himself. It's hard to say what the smugglers get out of the deal, but the king most likely ensures the operation of the repo out of necessity. The people of the planet are what he needs the most. He often abducts them as slaves, or worse, and without a steady drip of resources, they would all eventually die out. People travel hundreds of kilometers to buy from the repo, or steal from people who bought from it. So the little bottles of water and tins of food spread around the planet pretty well. I spoke with a friend of mine who's lived in the engine all his life, by the somewhat humble name of Humphrey. I'm told he's a very talented engineer, and meeting him in his shop was a very interesting experience as a sentient. He was fascinated by my chassis. He does have an unfortunate speech impediment, making talking somewhat painful for him, so he wasn't able to speak at great length, but he was able to impart some of his personal experience living in the engine. I recorded this conversation, and will replay some of his monologue here.
This engine is a very unkind place, but good place to live, not like wasteland. Lots of people, more metal. You want to know my life? Yes, not much. I knew nobody for first 20 years except old lady. Never knew if we were related, but took care of me. Thirst and hunger, those times. Surprised she survived until I grew. Throat still hurts from talking. Didn't learn language for a long time. She couldn't talk. Engineered own way of talking. More efficient for throat. Always liked metal, though. More here than anywhere. Always made much more sense than people to me. Always came naturally. People hired me later when they saw my machines. I know how to hide well, and my little machines are strong for me. I am safe in engine, but many aren't. Houses are built at shoddy, shitty, collapse all the time. People die from bad craftsmanship all the time here, probably daily. Not from my building, though. Never. I put in work, make safe before I make money. People fight a lot here, yes, but there's plenty, decent people. Engineers like me have good work, and merchants like you too, yeah. And peacekeepers are good here. People have friends, families, protect each other. Most people in roads won't shoot you for nothing like people in wasteland. Still, keep guard up. Never know when to trust strangers, but always trust friends. Nobody really attacks here in large numbers, though, like other places, because everything here is just here, yeah. Big machine, a lot of redundancy. Peel away part after part. Machine still runs.
Simply put, the engine has survived for so long, longer than most other settlements, because it has no system to tear down. It's just a collection of survivors. If you try to raid the whole town, you'll find there's no point, since everyone fends for themselves anyway. You'd be better off trying to raid a specific person's residence. Which people do, a lot, but the engine as a whole remains largely the same. The structures already look like rubble, so if you try to bomb the place, people will just make more houses out of what you bombed. Defense through redundancy is an interesting term for it, and I admit I wouldn't have thought of it that way had I not met Humphrey. Dry heart. Term of respect given to those who are generally very tough and skilled at survival. Having a dry heart suggests that the subject's heart still functions despite being metaphorically dry from a life of dehydration. 5. The crow's nest. Southeast of the engine, you'll find a strange region of black, gravelly sand, in some places hard-packed into rock. Roughly in the center of this region, you'll find the crow's nest, and you'll probably see it long before you reach it, as it's named for the tower at its center, which stands out as the tallest metal structure on the planet. Like the engine, the crow's nest was built from a crashed battleship, though it was built in much more of a coordinated fashion. The command tower, for which the community is named, sometimes referred to as the Palace Tower, or mistakenly called the crow's nest, was most likely the bridge of the crashed ship, extended on a long shaft for whatever reason a battleship would have to stretch its neck before it crashed. Some people wonder if the crow's nest and the engine are built from the same battleship, somehow split on descent and spread across the lands. I can't say it's untrue, but it is unlikely, as the metal is very different, and the ship the crow's nest is built from was confirmed to once be called Hugin, while the most of the engine's original name that could be recovered was something like the letter F. The crow's nest is often referred to by the locals as a stronghold more than a town or community, as it's surrounded by very strong walls adorned with 3 artillery cannons, evidently recovered from the wreckage. The walls are arranged triangularly, with the cannons mounted on moving rails which allow them full coverage around the stronghold. The houses and community, strongly built with many open areas for activity, are nestled safely within. The central ship from which the tower rises is often called the palace, a term which some are concerned carries too many regal connotations. This concern is unfounded. Few stand in defiance of the Scrap King with more passion than the citizens of this stronghold, and the use of regal terminology was originally made in snide parody of the monarchy in the scrap fields. In fact, their current leader, Caribou, has dubbed himself the Flare King, from his aptitude for the engineering of and communication using flares, which has developed greatly under his rule. The first leader was, according to the inscription within the palace, the leader of a large and unusually organized bandit group, who found the wreck of the battleship and decided to make it a home, building the walls from the outer armor plating. The culture of the crow's nest reflects that founding group to some degree, being quite martial, through necessity of the frequent assaults from bandits and the Scrap King's forces, as well as the harsh cold winters of the Black Gravelly region. Citizens of the stronghold are often given arms, or else arm themselves, and keep their eyes sharp and guns clean. The hierarchy resembles a chain of command, and the advice and sometimes orders of those in a higher standing are seldom shunned, as most of them understand they stand strongest when everyone works for the benefit of everyone else, and strive to rise to higher ranks. Punishment for insubordination is considered fair and just, usually imprisonment or the withholding of small luxuries, passed down in summary by superior-ranking individuals. Greater transgressions are met with at most banishment, and almost never execution. This system makes for rigid living, but those living it are comforted by the sense of strength the community gives them. Securing resources to be stored away within the walls is relatively simple most of the year, as the highly structured command chain makes resource distribution fair and conservative, and the relatively frequent assaults on the walls, as well as trade with the engine, makes acquisition steady and constant. That is, except in winter. The winters of the Black Gravel region reach lethally low temperatures for even the prepared, and so all citizens of the Crow's Nest must huddle around heat generators within the stronghold and not leave until the coldest days have passed. That's when proper storage and distribution of resources becomes most important, and the stronghold is most vulnerable to attack. Fortunately, there aren't many bandits who would be able to mount an adequate assault in such temperatures, and the Scrap King's forces would freeze to death within hours. Bandits still do try to break the walls, however, driven by the rumors of stockpiled weapons and food, and whatever else that lies within. Ironically, when their raids fail, their own weapons and rations are added to the stockpile. The reason for the Scrap King's assaults are supposedly for similar reasons, but it's widely understood he does it out of spite for the place, especially since the new leader dubbed himself Flare King. The Flare King, Caribou, still current leader of the stronghold, was always inclined to rethink tradition. As such, his command has been a bit more lenient than his predecessors, and he's been praised by many as the greatest leader the Crow's Nest has ever had. One important decision was to order the excavation of what wreckage of their battleship still remained buried, often called the mysterious Palace Basement. It had been left untouched for generations, a standing order of the second ever leader to command the stronghold, through fear of setting off volatile and possibly mass-destructive weapons held within that could turn the entire place into a crater. Caribou believed this concern unfounded. Having often traded with the Crow's Nest in the past, I was honored with the opportunity to speak with Caribou more on this, and I will record here his words.
The palace always interested me, especially the naming of it. I've always smiled at the idea of the Scrap King sitting up in his big scrappy palace fuming about us taking his terminology for ourselves. That's why I call myself the King of Crow's Nest, of course. But the name Caribou came from our palace. We were always told to be careful in there because it's way older than even the walls and may contain dangers. The room where the lower floors were sealed was forbidden. Apparently, the first settlers found bombs down there and were scared they'd blow the whole community up. That always bothered me. The idea that we were all standing on top of a potentially massive store of weapons and stuff that we were just too afraid to go looking for. The bombs must not be armed, or they'd have exploded when the ship that is the palace first crashed. So, when I was a boy, or well, girl back then, I snuck into that forbidden room and tried to pry into the walls and flooring. I didn't have much luck at first, but I did uncover a quote apparently ripped from the pages of a book. The caribou feeds the wolf, but it is the wolf who keeps the caribou strong. I didn't know what a caribou or a wolf was, and I still don't know. Most likely some off-world creatures, but the idea got through to me. It was a perfect description of our home. The Scrap King tyrant we were all taught about and the harsh bandits outside were always feeding on us. That's why the Crow's Nest was, and still is, so strong. That's when I knew I had to become a leader. Such a tiny wisdom in even the very surface of the basement, more wise than the elder commanders, and had been sitting here ever since before they were in command, or even born. So, I rose to the ranks. It was hard, and it took most of my life, but here I am. And those old commanders are gone now. People always seemed to like the way I led them, so I was very much welcomed. And I had a lot of ideas I've been planning for a long time. I loosened the hierarchy just a bit, gave people a little more free time, and naturally people loved it. Some of the other commanders were worried I was being too lenient, but in time they understood. It's the wolf who keeps us strong, not just us commanders. Turns out, a lot of people felt the same way about the palace basement that I did. When I announced my order to start carefully excavating the palace basement, a lot of people were excited. A lot of others were afraid. But the more we uncovered, the less afraid they became. We always imagined, from what we were taught, the palace basement was empty and full of dangerous things that weren't worth the risk, and taking too much gravel out of it would collapse the palace entirely. But it was actually quite a bit smaller and more compacted than we thought. The rooms were all very compressed from the impact of the ship's crash, and most of the artifacts were too damaged to recognize. The crumpled metal was put to very good use, helping expand the stronghold and the walls outward. And since the palace still stood at no risk of collapsing, we used a now clear basement for important storage. The few artifacts that survived were also put to good use. There was a good store of interesting things with no practical use, which were put in a small museum section of the palace. The coat you see me wear now came from there. It's well made, and this soft material around the shoulders seems to be called fur? It's become a bit of a signature for me, and some people know the Flare King by my coat more than my face. Another artifact we got from there I'm quite fond of was a cannon, partially broken, that we managed to turn into a flare launching device mounted on top of the palace tower. The engineers did very fine work with it, more than they even realized. As it turns out, that beauty can fire a signal flare halfway across the planet. I've always loved flares. They can signal distress, a valuable find, a coming enemy, or many other things. They're also pretty easy to weaponize if you know how. It may sound silly, but they're an important part of our culture. the palace towers lined with small mounted flare guns all up it, which act as secondary weapons to the railed cannons on top of the walls. But we also fire very short-ranged and pretty flares from the tower at the end of every winter, or after a particularly fruitful victory, to celebrate our survival.
What an eccentric leader he is! It should be pretty clear at this point how the crow's nest is defended, with a proverbial shield and spear. But despite the aggressive and martial approach, they never lead assaults on others, opting for a proudly defensive stance. They only take from those who try to take from them, and despite their common hatred of the Scrap King, they have no interest in overthrowing him or taking down the monarchy, instead simply wishing to push his forces out of their home. However, as Caribou implied, if the Scrap King weren't intent on conquering, the crow's nest would lose a valuable source of resources. It's a similar dilemma to the one the entire planet is facing. In any case, the stronghold still stands as one of the strongest communities on the planet, and the occasional flare-lit fireside festivities within the safe enclosure of the walls are an inspiring thing to behold. Atop the rusty husks of long-dead battle, we build our home, a fire against the cold winds. Inscription on a plaque within the crow's nest, written by the original founder. 6. The Salt Pits. For any readers who are asking, why don't more people live underground to escape the harsh winds of the surface? We come to the Salt Pits, a community founded on the same question. Far north and a little east of the crow's nest, the sands start to get pinker and saltier as you approach the massive crater in which the community lies. Nobody is quite sure how the crater got there. Some say the sheer size of it and the large area around it where its pink salts can be found suggests it must have been a meteor from long ago, while others say the fact it wasn't filled with sand by the time it was discovered suggests it must have been a more recent event, such as the blast zone of some massive weapon deployed during the Great Battle. Regardless of its origin, it is a sight to behold from the edge. An enormous canyon of white and pinkish crystals mined nearly to the stubs, scaffolding of metal and rock woven all along the rocks, with dimly lit tunnel entrances dotting the entire inner surface. These tunnels lead below the surface, to the winding caves and passages that make up the mining community of the Salt Pits, who often refer to themselves as salt miners. It is by far the largest community in terms of area, though the population is much more sparse than the engine. It really is difficult to convey the sheer scale of the tunnels and caves. There are many subterranean maps created by the miners' cartographers, but even they don't paint a full picture when put together, and they rarely line up perfectly with one another. Rubble carted up from the digging below form piles large and old enough to look like part of the terrain, interspersed throughout the area surrounding the crater. Salt is evidently an important part of this community, given the name of the area, the people, and many of their inventions. Naturally occurring salts haven't been found in any other part of the planet to my knowledge, and though the abundance of a substance with the tendency to expedite thirst seem a cruel irony on a planet with no natural water, people have found many uses for it. It can be used to preserve foods, as an ingredient in various warming tonics that may or may not work, as a cleaning substance, a frivolously inefficient topping for foods, and many others. It's even used in the liquid salt electrical components invented in the pits. Salt has been a part of the culture of the miners for so long that when they discovered other forms of ancient crystals with other properties far below, they simply called them different forms of salt. Trading these salts, in their many forms, makes for a reliable source of outside resources, especially some of the more medicinal salts, which are very valuable to off-worlders. The most important part of the culture of the salt pits is, of course, mining. The tunnels have been expanding for many generations, since before I came to this planet, growing farther and deeper in search of many things. Materials, for one. Though this planet is dry of exotic metals such as copper and gold, there are scraps of iron and various minerals, and aforementioned variations of salt that prove very useful, and in some cases nutritious when mixed with water. Room is another motivation factor for all the digging. They expand their territory with every centimeter they chip away, each hole they drill, and each boulder they blast, meeting no resistance from other people as they do so. They carve housing, working, and social spaces out of the caves they excavate themselves. Many years ago, a drill discovered the first of the many deep natural cave systems, which massively expanded their operation and led to another minor motivation for mining, that being exploration. The structures of some of these caves suggested they were formed by the flow of some liquid, assumed to be water, rather than magma, which leads into the third and most important major motivation for excavation, that being water. The idea of natural water being held somewhere deep below the ground has been the main reason for the salt miners' coordination since the pits were first founded. The reasoning is simple. The planet is covered in sand, or a type that must have been formed by more erosion than just wind, suggesting there was once water on the planet. The water must have been evaporated by the shine millions of years ago before it went dim. Therefore, the original miners apparently reasoned, there must be water underground that was sheltered from the evaporation. The discovery of water-eroded caves further reinforced this theory. The idea of some subterranean wellspring has been permeated and ingrained through so many generations of miners that the idea is almost religious or mythical, so that no amount of digging without finding it will lessen its cultural significance. The first scout to discover the natural water, it's often said, will be given a lifetime of luxury and rest. Were a wellspring ever to be found, the salt miners could become powerful enough to rule the entire planet. And I can't say that would be such a bad thing. For most, it would be considerably preferable to the Scrap King's rule. The social hierarchy of the salt pits is utilitarian, its culture focused around a strong work ethic. Operations and disputes are overseen and mediated by a strong and wise member of the community known as foreman. Despite the suffix, the position is not exclusive to men, with the help of coordinators who preside over farther-reaching sections of the caves and tunnels. Though not everyone in the salt pits is a miner, they are all expected to do their part to aid the community. Luxuries are given only to those who've done their daily work as assigned by the foreman or coordinators, and all who live there are expected to strive for strength and endurance, even if their job doesn't require it. There are many jobs other than miner which are just as, if not almost more important, such as cultivating and preparing meal beetles, their term for corpse beetles, and dry shrooms, a form of fungus discovered underground that grows from salt and the tiniest particles of moisture. Engineering equipment for mining, living, and pumping surface air to the tunnels, and seismic tuning, the strange and impressive art of listening to vibrations in the rock to determine the approximate shapes and compositions of undiscovered caves, among many other smaller jobs. Once again, I attempted to interview a denizen of the salt pits, and was able to speak with the current foreman, Tesla. Unfortunately, he asked that what he said not be recorded directly, and only vaguely retold in my own words, for the safety of his miners, should the Scrap King ever find my words. Here is my abridged summary, then. Tesla spoke of his life as a miner, growing up excavating caves, and only ever seeing the sky of the surface once during his childhood. He was appointed foreman, as is tradition, by the previous foreman, for his hard work and plans to improve the working conditions. He has been and is enacting most of those plans, and though many miners dislike him, most understand he does his job well, and they're all the better for having him as a leader. This was confirmed by smaller interviews with locals. After a rather lengthy rant on the strength of his people and the strength of the stable stone above our heads and below our feet, he related the recent discovery of a stone beetle, conferred the name Frey, an ancient and confirmed to be natural fossil of a beetle, which could be an ancestor of the modern meal beetle. This was a shocking discovery for me, and I had to have him show it to me himself. It was hard to tell, but when arranged properly, the stone fragments did indeed resemble a giant beetle. Though considerably different in size and shape, it did have some similarities. The previous theory of the beetles is that they arrived on and adapted to the planet sometime between the battle and the arrival of first settlers. And though this could still be true, it was hard to deny this rock was proof this planet once held life. With this amazing discovery that would no doubt impact my own people's culture significantly still on my mind, he went on about various technologies made from mining, such as drilling machines, blasting charges, breathing apparatuses, and the salt batteries and electrical components invented by his personal friend Goretti. Tesla continued to speak on the importance of the seismic tuners I mentioned earlier, the lifelong training they go through, how most of them were born blind, and the history suggesting their talents grew from the systematic failure of the subterranean scanning equipment they used. He also spoke of the current deepest natural cave to be known, named the Sauna, for its unbelievably high natural temperatures of nearly 20 degrees. However, breathing in dust from the salt crystals in this cave would quickly lead to salt lung, a condition categorized by the sufferer's lungs being clogged or lacerated by tiny crystals forming in the moisture of their lungs. Special masks must be worn to visit the cave, and a tunnel leading to it is rather dangerous, so not many people are able to enjoy its warmth. That was my personal retelling of most of what Tesla told me. I asked multiple times about progress towards finding the mythical wellspring, and he would only say they were yet to find any evidence, but the idea kept his people strong. The salt pits, as I've told of them, may seem a very ripe target for the desperate, and indeed it sometimes is, though the defense employed by the miners is minimal. A thin wire fence surrounds the place, but it's more of a warning than a wall. If you try to climb in the pit without the proper gear of clearance, you'll either slip on a rock and fall to your death, or be split like a stone by a miner repelling your trespass. The few times the miners fight outsiders, they do so brutally, collapsing tunnels on their heads, throwing charges at them, or scalding them with molten salt. Most bandits steer well clear of the salt pits. Drowning, term for drinking all of one's water at once, or drinking more water than one needs, usually resulting in them dying of thirst later. 7. The greenhouse. If you travel north far enough from any other point on the surface, you'll eventually come to a hilly region around the very northernmost point of the planet. At this point, called the North Apex, sits a structure called the greenhouse. This structure seals the community within, shelled in both a literal and metaphorical sense, since its original construction was ordered by one of the previous Scrap Kings. Not much is known about the place, but what is known is that the name, referring to a housed ecosystem that allows plants to grow, a mythical concept to most who live on this planet, is not misleading. Inside apparently sprawls a thriving forest of trees and plants and animals, all from off-world, warmed and watered by the monarchy. Physically, it sounds like a divine place to be, but nothing in this world seems allowed to be perfect, because according to all accounts, living inside the greenhouse is almost as treacherous and deadly as outside. Rules are violently enforced, social status is treated as a vital resource, and freedom is crushed into mulch for the plant life. The Scrap King and his nobles, both inside and above, are worshipped like gods, by laws enforced more vehemently than any others. Nobody is allowed to enter or leave, so information on the inside, such as political hierarchy, is hard to come by. Though from what little I did hear, I can say it's a very fragile hierarchy, rife with assassination, and most likely overseen by a close subordinate of the Scrap King, and not always by the king himself. More can be said about the outside, though. It's impenetrable. It would have to be, with a name like that heard by people so desperate for water. The shine never fully sets on the northern apex, nor does it ever fully rise, due to the planet's rotation, making for consistent temperatures, albeit still rather low. The greenhouse is not only a fully artificially maintained ecosystem on the inside, but from outside it's a fortress on all sides, including above and below. It's built like a shell, enormous and cylindrical, with a relatively flat cone on its top face and very few entrances. Many bandits and rebels have tried to crack it over the years to no effect, as not only is the outside built of armor plating more solid than the walls of the crow's nest, the halls just beyond the armor are filled with royal guards, who ask no questions and take no prisoners. The elaborate alert system, most likely controlled by technology originated from off-world, makes a stealthy assault nearly impossible, and the few doors that allow shipments in and out are made of armor twice as thick as the shell, and are always the most guarded. However, some sly few have been able to slip in and out with the shipments, though they're rarely able to take much with them save information. One such individual, born inside the greenhouse and going by the name Loretta, who first escaped, then snuck in and out enough times to make a business out of it, allowed a few words on her experience of inside. Unfortunately, she refused to give away too much for her own safety. Here's what of relevance she said.
It really is dreadful in there. Oh, you lovely scrappers out here hear about a green paradise and think it'll set you for life. But frankly, the place reeks. The forest stinks of death. The little streams that run through it are choked with the black sludge of it, and the plants all drink in it inherit its stench. Water is a luxury, out here to be sure, but in there, it's hardly a right. Kiss the proper asses, do the proper work, never speak up, and you'll probably get your share. Everyone who lives there is putting on an act every second of their lives. And if they break character, they'll have unthinkable things done to them, and their corpse will be ground into food for the animals, the plants, and even the nobles. I was born clever and slippery, so I never had to live that life. But I've seen more than enough of it. I've probably had more brushes with death than most of the tough guys out here. Had to slit more throats, too. Not much more to say, really. I'm sure you'd love to know how I got out, but I wouldn't want to reveal all my secrets now, would I?
I do wish there was more to say about the greenhouse. Loretta refused even to elaborate on whether the stench she mentioned was literal or a colorful metaphor. I can, however, share some rumors, none of which Loretta was able to confirm or deny, though she seemed to think they were possible. One such rumor suggests the source of water inside isn't from off-world, but in fact originates from a wellspring discovered at the very north apex. That one in particular seems to me like wishful thinking. Peacekeeper scouts have reported ships from the scrap fields landing on the porthole in the very top of the shell, most likely delivering things and people. Another rumor comes from those scouts that the Scrap King frequents the place in his ship adorned with guns and silver, which is most likely true, and why the rebel group has such an interest in the greenhouse. Some more troubling rumors suggest that there's an amassing of weaponry taking place somewhere inside, and that the king is planning some sort of attack or even takeover, though the thought could also have been spread to pique even more interest in raiding the place or to scare people away. Piece of shit in a sand trap. Expression to describe something as not only worthless, but difficult or dangerous to obtain or perform. 8. The coast. At last we come to the coast, a community splayed on sharp blue sand, and the closest known residents to the southern apex, the inverse of the northern apex. The blue sands border around a region known as the ocean. Despite its name, it is in fact the driest region on the planet, named instead for its vast featurelessness. Where in other regions the desert may be riddled with dunes, rock features, and scrap metal, in the ocean there is only flat sand for hundreds of kilometers. And in contrast to the northern apex, the shine almost never rises. The southern apex itself is lost somewhere over the horizon, looking from the coast into its empty neighbor. As you can imagine from the lack of shine, this is the coldest and harshest area on the planet, with the cyclical rolling wind they call the sea breeze being literally fatal to most, even with proper protective clothing. However, one resident of the coast, named Kawayo, is said to have recently traveled the whole distance of that enormous expanse and touched the southernmost point, earning herself the title Walker of the Ocean. Though I can't verify the truth of this legend, as this feat seems mathematically impossible. The fact that a community could survive in such conditions seems impossible, and you're probably thinking it won't last. But in fact, the coast is the oldest living community on the planet. It was apparently originally constructed as a base for expeditions into the ocean, or so I'm told, but it hasn't been used for that in a long time, and the population has dwindled to less than 30 people on average. Physically, it's no more than a series of heat tents and metal windshields worked into a long boardwalk of shoddily welded plate metal. Smaller than some tiny communities I haven't written of in this encyclopedia, but I include it here for its age and perplexing nature. It takes a lot to survive there. The residents of the ocean are the toughest, and by consequence, most unpleasant people you'll find anywhere on the planet. Their sparse culture revolves around deprivation of essentials, putting one's own survival above even family, traveling great distance to steal or trade resources, and, unfortunately, cannibalism. Corpse beetles can't survive in the temperatures they live in after all, and the food they steal from the north usually doesn't last long enough to be fully sustainable. All this to say, the place could not be more hostile, in both culture and environment. All shut tents, freezing winds, and darkness. Most residents leave for better places as soon as they're able, and those who don't are often perhaps a little too proud of their ability to survive. I happen to know a former resident of the coast by the name of Keone, now a renowned member of the Peacekeepers, and when I asked for an interview on her birthplace, she simply said,
Place is a shithole. Never go there.
She did no more than scoff at my requests for further information. I'm afraid there's not much more to say about the coast, other than its simple defense method summed up by Keone's words. It's simply not worth approaching by any measure, no matter what you're looking for. It felt appropriate to end my writing on such a cold and bitter area. Cold cradle. The quality of being accustomed to harsh cold by resisting the futile urge to keep one's body as warm as possible. This concludes the Encyclopedia of the Horsehead Desert. I thank you for reading my words, and I hope you have learned of my home and will remember its beauty and its monstrosity as I've described it. Wherever I am at the time of your reading, I am, or was, the sentient living in the land of scrap, Ida, the beetle merchant.